From ancient times to the start of the 20th century, the legendary Silk Road linked the Mediterranean to China, where caravans entered through the Jade Gate. An expedition of some 11,000 kilometers across steppes, mountains and deserts. For 700 years, the ՍΟՂΔΙԸΝs were caravanners who dominated the roads through these hostile regions and specialized in organizing and guiding caravans between the east and the west. The city of Roħi in Belgium. A piece of fabric is carefully preserved in the Notre Dame Church in Roħi. Silk brocade found in a 6th century reliquary. Even though it has lost its sheen, the brocade still hints at a pattern depicting two deer facing each other inside a circle. The origin of this pattern raised questions with researchers. Though part of the answer was in fact inscribed on the brocade itself.
Et voilà l'inscription Zandani.
A two-line text, written in an ancient Persian dialect, was printed on the reverse of the fabric. The first line of this text simply mentioned that the fabric measured 61 handspans. The second line mentioned Zandaniji, which in Persian means that it came from Zandana. This dialect was spoken about 1500 years ago in a region located between the desert and the mountains, previously known as СУՂДИё, the present-day Uzbekistan. Bukhara, a СУՂДИё city-state. Zandana, a village near Bukhara. This small village still rears silkworms. Using a traditional method, the cocoons are gathered by hand. Each May, women celebrate the first gathering. Persian chroniclers from the Middle Ages recounted that Zandana was a major centre for silk. СУՂДИё was famed for its silk, which it exported to Persia and India. Central Asia. The course of the Zarafshan River, which means giver of life, is born from the melting of the permanent snow in the heavenly mountains, known as the Tian Shan Mountains by the Chinese, and flows through the arid lands of Tajikistan before disappearing in the sands of Bukhara. The river crosses the whole of СУՂДИё. In ancient times, this was a region at the borders of the Persian Empire and was colonized by Alexander the Great. His successors constructed a vast network of canals there, which lay behind its economic development. In the villages of the upper Zarafshan Valley, where ancient customs still persist, the СУՂДИё language is still spoken. This is the case in the village of Artush, which can only be reached after a trip of over 3 hours along a track that winds its way between the steep slopes of the Tian Shan Mountains. The hamlet has only 300 inhabitants. They rear sheep, goats, and still grow a few cereal crops, according to a lifestyle and customs that seem unchanging. Before newborn babies are laid in their cribs for the first time, the crib is purified by fire. This purification ceremony has been handed down for generations. Today, at the break of dawn, all the inhabitants of the village are going to visit the house where the Rafpov family live, in honor of Jakongir, their second son. The high point of the ceremony occurs when the mother of the child places honey in his mouth. And his father gives him a coin to hold in his hand.
کلان شوی موی گهواربانان کردگی بودن پدرم کردگی بودن مادرم و مقصدی اونه که کودک به اصل میتیم که در آینده دهن شیرین شود و به شیرینی گردد همین کار پول میتیم که давлатманд шавад.
از زبان سوغدی‌ها همه چیز موندگی با کلان ما همین کارهای کردیم افتادیم بیان بر همین ما هم دوام داشتگی.
Our knowledge about the Sogdians mostly originates from Chinese chronicles. One of these chronicles, dating back over 1,000 years, described this ceremony, placing honey in the mouth. The honey is to soften his speech, and the glue to convey the wish that money does not run away from him. Chronicles recount that the Sogdians learnt to read and write at the age of 5. At the age of 20, boys who were not destined to become farmers were encouraged to leave the village to start a commercial apprenticeship. The Sogdians were not warriors. Half were traders and half were farmers. This ancestral commercial tradition resulted from the privileged geographic location of Sogdiana. Caravans travelling between India and Russia and the Mediterranean and China were obliged to pass through the region. This commercial route was the most popular road in the history of the world. Chinese chroniclers described a savage region where Huns would pillage caravans and massacre travellers. Chinese emperors sent military expeditions to pacify the region. In the 5th century AD, the Chinese constructed garrison cities along the caravan routes. However, the routes remained just as dangerous. The Sogdians specialized in organizing and guiding caravans through Central Asia, exercising a monopoly over anyone wishing to cross these hostile lands. A pilgrim crossing Sogdiana in around 620 recounted that he travelled with a caravan of 600 camels, led by 240 Sogdians, and loaded with over 10,000 pieces of silk. Penjikent, right in the centre of Sogdiana, a town in West Tajikistan, on the banks of the Zarafshan. These days, the region is populated by Tajiks, the descendants of the Sogdians. Outside the town, ruins spread over an entire hillside represent the place where the Sogdians built one of their cities. Teams from the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg have been excavating the area since 1946. Professor Boris Marshak has devoted his research to Sogdian cities and heads the team. The Sogdians did not use stone, and wood was rare in these arid regions. Houses and ramparts were built out of mud bricks, dried in the sun. Houses were composed of a ground floor, with many small rooms no more than 2 meters wide. The ceilings were arched. Surrounded by ramparts, the city covered 13 hectares with a high density of dwellings. Farms were constructed outside the walls. When a family became bigger, the house could be raised by 1 or 2 stories. Sometimes it even spilled over into the street. This was the only way in which the city could respond to the impossibility of building outside the walls that protected it from the hostile environment. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, Penjikent had 7,000 inhabitants living within the confines of its walls. The excavations progressed slowly. However, they yielded some wonderful surprises.
Эта комната, там эта комната с зернохранилищем. Пока она чистая, если они снимут, будет хорошо.
Such as the discovery of around 50 extremely beautiful frescoes, some hardly damaged by time. They've been restored with the help of the University of Tokyo. The work was carried out by specialists who had to revive colors that had faded over 1,000 years.
Очень слабо.
The golden age of Penjikent was reconstructed using virtual imaging. It was the city that the caravanners would discover at the end of their long trips. They entered its gates and headed to the market in the center of the city. The market sold products originating from all over Eurasia: Persian silver tableware, Indian pepper, and Chinese tea and brocades. The Chinese visited the city to purchase the famous celestial horses that, according to legend, sweated blood. СУღДИён minted its own currency. This bronze coin is an imitation of a Chinese sarpak, as the СУღДИёns mainly traded with the Chinese. In the center of the city, near the market, the house of a rich merchant has been reconstructed on the basis of documents from the period. After entering into a cool and dark hall, the visitor was confronted by brilliantly colored frescoes depicting СУღДИёns on a red backdrop. A little further on, as if in a snapshot, dancers were depicted holding each other's hands. Under the dome of the large reception room, the visitor would see frescoes and statues paying homage to the divinities of the Silk Road. Rays of light streaming through skylights illuminated Eurasian gods and mythical animals. In the center, inspired by Indian art, the goddess of fertility took center stage. Next to her appeared heroes from Persian legends. The researchers were also surprised to discover a fresco inspired by Aesop's fable of the goose that laid the golden eggs. Possibly a reminder to merchants that in business, care should always be taken. Inspired by an Indian legend, another fresco depicts the story of a man killed by a domesticated monkey. These pictorial representations confirm that thanks to СУღДИён traders, ideas and goods traveled well together.
СУღДИЙцы стали основным народом путешественников, основным народом, который был везде. Кроме того, СУღДИЙцы сами никакой империи не создавали. Поэтому у них не было вот такой своей культуры, которая бы презирала чужие культуры. И в конце концов сделались самыми процветающими торговцами на всем шелковом пути. Что касается культуры, то такого синтеза культур, какой мы видим в СУღДИОне, мы тоже больше уже нигде не видим. Здесь самый полный синтез.
In common with Penjikent, СУღДИОна had other cities of caravan traders. These were oasis cities, organized into city-states, such as Samarkand and Bukhara. They competed against each other, as a centralized power did not exist in СУღДИОна.
Потому что у них не было своего сильного государства. У них были маленькие города-государства, такие как Пенджикент. Их колонии были в Китае, вплоть до столицы Китая, и в Шинджане, и всюду по дороге, в Северной Киргизии, в Казахстане, всюду были СУღДИЙские колонии. И в этих колониях жили люди, которые знали друг друга. Молодые люди СУღДИЙские после 20 лет отправлялись странствовать, вести торговые дела за границей.
Among the mural frescoes found in Penjikent, one evokes a feast for rich merchants. Holding a cup, clothed in silk and looking prosperous. They are clearly businessmen whose trading on the Silk Road has been successful, probably at a high price. As venturing into the Silk Lands meant facing avalanches, risking being set upon by bandits, infected by fever from the marshes, or attacked by wild beasts. With their caravans, they crossed over the 4,000-meter passes in the Tian Shan Mountains and traversed the formidable Taklamakan Desert to reach the border of the Chinese Empire. Tor Fan, between the Gobi and Taklamakan deserts, is the first advanced Chinese post in nomadic territory. It was the first, the oldest, and one of the most important commercial stages on the Silk Road. In fact, it was impossible to avoid. The ancient city of Gaochang, at the gates of Turfan, was one of the garrison towns built by the Chinese in the 4th century to guarantee the safety of the Silk Road. The СУღДИUN established a trading post there. Several multicolored figurines were found in the tombs. This one represents a СУღДИUN merchant. Contrary to the Chinese, his features are striking, with a prominent nose and eyes without a slant. Like this bearded СУღДИUN, whose Chinese hat revealed that he lived in the city, he worked as a correspondent, an agent, or a representative of compatriots who were traveling with their caravans. After Turfan, the caravanners had to spend a few weeks crossing the Gobi Desert before reaching the famous Jade Gate that guarded entry to the Middle Kingdom. If they arrived safe and sound with all their goods, they must have paid a heavy tribute to the nomads in the region they had crossed, the only way of ensuring their protection. Using the caravans was the most certain way of traveling in safety. Monks, Buddhist pilgrims, Christian priests from Persia, and Zoroastrians from Bactria all traveled using the caravans. Numerous documents attest to the commercial exchanges between the СУღДИUN and the Chinese, such as this contract of sale. In China at that time, the exiled СУღДИUN used their original town as a family name. In this contract of sale for a horse, the seller was called Kang, which means that he came from Samarkand, Kang in Chinese. The Kang were СУღДИUN living in Turfan, and 3 of them vouched for the honesty of the horse trader. Their trade was based on a strong sense of solidarity. Organized into clans, they lived together in the majority of Chinese towns. The historian Rung Qing Jiang specializes in the СУღДИUN.
那么这个萨宝统治下的这么一个聚落，它第一的功能，我想就是做生意，它这个应该有送往迎来的作用。所以在那个地方，如果生意做得好，可能慢慢的又形成下一个 colony， 下一个聚落。所以我想，它这个总体的发展趋势是从西到东一步步来。
After Turfan, Dunhuang, located right next to the desert, was one of the last important stages before arriving in the Chinese capital. For thousands of years, the oasis has been resisting the onslaught of the sand. Into the cliffs that protect the city, Buddhist monks dug many caves in the 6th century AD. They concealed Greco-Buddhist stucco heads and many frescoes, the result of the contact between Chinese, Indian, and Greco-Roman civilizations. In one of the caves, a fresco depicts СУღДИUN merchants being attacked by bandits. They were begging for their lives to be spared. Pieces of silk were spread at their feet. Documents found in Dunhuang relate the adventures of these merchants. They're written in СУღДИUN. Amongst these documents, 8 letters dating back to the 4th century have been found. These are the oldest known СУღДИUN texts. Professor Sims Williams, a specialist in СУღДИUN, has studied these letters. Their purpose was to exchange information between merchants. We are ready to send 2,500 measures of pepper. We are just about to leave for Lowland to purchase silk.
Of course, it was very important for the СУღДИUN merchants to have good information about the markets for their commodities that they wanted to sell, and to know where they could buy the things they wanted to get in exchange, where they could buy them at a good price. Equally, it was very important for them to know about the political situation, where it was safe to travel, and where one could do good business, therefore.
A letter sent by a СУღДИUN to his country of origin, 3,000 kilometers away, relates the plundering of a Chinese city. Attacked by nomadic tribes, Luoyang was burnt down. The inhabitants fled, and the town no longer resembles the one it used to. The merchant concluded, "If the worst should happen to me, please take care of my son and train him so that he can become a good merchant." Political and commercial information traveled along the СУღДИUN network that covered all of China. The success of the СУღДИANs owed much to their ability to collect and take advantage of such information.
但是这个粟特人这个贸易的网络很大，它不仅做这个粟特本土，也就是中亚和中国的贸易，它也做这个中国和北方的游牧民族，或者中国人跟这个印度人这个贸易。所以我们说它是中古时期这个贸易的一种担当者。
This map, established by Professor Rong Qinjiang, shows the main СУღДИAN colonies in China. They date back to the Tang period. He's identified almost 30 along the route from Kashgar to Xi'an. At the time, Xi'an was the capital of the Han dynasty and then the Tang dynasty, dynasties that would turn China into a great empire. It was also the final destination of the caravans. They arrived in Xi'an along this road, the end of the Silk Road. It was the final point of the Eurasian Road from Byzantium to China, covering 11,000 kilometers, a unique voyage, one of the most remarkable in the history of the world. In May 2000, an archaeological discovery in the suburbs of Xi'an confirmed the presence of the СУღДИёНs in China. Coffins, of a type unknown in China, were found in a building site. The base on which they were resting was decorated with bas-reliefs and vermilion, and depicted the daily life of the deceased. This scene represents a feast. It shows dancers surrounded by musicians, playing instruments that are not Chinese, but Persian. These illustrations differ radically from Chinese paintings from the same period. However, a СУღДИён couple is shown in a Chinese-style house. This confirmed that they had settled for a lengthy period in China. The epitaph engraved on this grave intrigued the archaeologists. They deciphered the word Sabao. Professor Rong Qin-jiang has an opinion on the meaning of this word.
那在中文里把它翻成萨宝这个词呢，实际是译自粟特文的一个词，它的名字就本意就是对商 caravan leader 对商首领的意思。恐怕这个跟粟特人他本身第一目的是要做生意了，所以他这个在这个商业目的，他一定要选取那些比较交通比较发达的地方。
These travelers brought with them a culture enriched by their contact with all other civilizations in Central Asia. From the West, they brought a few things that the Chinese would especially appreciate: music, dance, fashion, vines, and cuisine. In addition to Buddhism, they contributed to the spreading of Zoroastrianism and Persian Christianity. They were the ones who brought colored glass, pearls, coral, and the Persian blue makeup that was so greatly favored by Chinese empresses to the imperial court. The СУღДИёНs taught the Chinese a different method of weaving. The traditional Chinese method only permitted simple drawings, plants, or geometrical patterns to be reproduced. This technique brings out the pattern by using colored threads, attached horizontally to the loom. The drawback of this method is that the threads cannot be replaced by others of a different color. They therefore had to make do with simple patterns. The СУღДИёNs had developed a more sophisticated weaving technique. It took inspiration from the technique used for weaving Persian carpets. Abundantly colored, the СУღДИёN brocades resulted from a combination of Chinese silk and the traditional techniques from Western Asia. This pattern, representing animals inside a circle, is a traditional one used on СУღДИUN brocades. The aesthetics are representative of the СУღДИUN culture. This depiction of animals in a circle shows several objects of Persian origin, such as this silver ewer. СУღДИUN art took its inspiration from traditional Persian art. Professor Regula Shorter from the Centre for Textile Research in Switzerland is a historian specializing in ancient fabrics.
Und sie haben Strömungen und Tendenzen und Vorlieben von ihren Partnern rundherum gekannt und deswegen auch gerne dann die Dinge aufgenommen, von denen sie denken konnten, dass sie beliebt waren und dass sie auch gekauft wurden.
This traditional Persian pattern in a closed circle bears the name renju, which means pearl necklace. Symbolizing the Eurasian cultural intermingling, the silk used in the brocade is Chinese, the weaving СУღДИUN, and the pattern Persian. It was at the request of one of the emperors of the Sui dynasty that a СУღДИUN wove the first brocade. Little by little, the СУღДИUN weaving method superseded the Chinese method. According to legend, the СУღДИUN stole the jealously guarded secret of how to manufacture silk from the Chinese. It was via the СУღДИANs that it arrived in the West. The Nara Temple in Japan piously preserves a vestige of СУღДИUN culture. A silk brocade representing a lion hunt. It was woven in China during the Tang dynasty. Its circular pattern shows Persian inspiration, whilst the depiction of the hunters is characteristic of СУღДИUN brocades. In the 8th century, the Tang Empire was at the height of its power. With regard to art, this period represented the pinnacle of Chinese classicism. Wang Wei founded the Chinese painting school. As for poetry, Li Bo and Tu Fu were producing their greatest work. China became Buddhist, Confucianist and Taoist. The empire stretched as far as Xinjiang and was pacified and unified after 4 centuries of upheaval. However, an ambitious СУღДИAN would suddenly cause a confrontation with the Chinese. 2 centuries of peaceful cohabitation were compromised. His name was An Lushan. He plotted against the aging Chinese emperor. It was civil war. This was such a bitter period that it still remains present in the Chinese collective memory, and an opera has been devoted to the subject. An Lushan was a soldier who rose to the highest rank of the Chinese army, that of Grand General of the Hardy Cavalry. He amassed a considerable wealth whilst trading on the Silk Road. This wealth enabled him to purchase weapons, build a fortified city, and recruit an army. He used the СУღДИAN communications network to issue his orders. He found favor with Princess Yang Guisei, the first concubine of Emperor Tong Xuanzong. who he then overthrew and deposed to take his place. The year was 756. He plundered the imperial palace, seized the treasures of the empire, and crippled the population with taxes. He ended up being assassinated by his own son. Against a background of famine and floods, a civil war began that would last for 8 years. At the end of the period, the Tang dynasty was restored. The backlash against the СУღДИЙОНs was massively widespread and bloody. In 674, Arabs from the Middle East conquered the СУღДИЙОН city-states. The vanquished population preserved their language, Persian, but were forced to convert to Islam. However, their culture did not disappear. It was so rich that the invaders ended up adopting it and appropriating the СУღДИЙОN know-how. Until the beginning of the 20th century, many of their descendants occupied high posts within the various authorities governing the region. The successors of the СУღДИЙОNs, now separated by the modern borders of the states of Central Asia, currently live in several countries of the ex-Soviet Union. As far back as it's possible to go in history, very few populations without an empire or military strength have contributed so much to the contact between the cultures of the West and the East as the caravanners did.